The past year and a bit in Conan Exiles has been rough. Since June 2023 we've experienced the Age of War, and as it finally comes to a close, I wanted to get a better perspective on the Age as a whole, to look at what caused it to be possibly one of Conan's worst periods. The Age of War came hot on the heels of a relatively successful Age of Sorcery Chapter 3, an update that, in my opinion, was fairly good. Sorcery, of course, was long requested, as was the addition of a new dungeon, and as we came into this new age, war sounded like an exciting premise, especially with the impending arrival of one of the most well-known regions in the world of Conan, the Stygian Empire. With a decent lead-in and such a wide and varied premise, where did it all go wrong? The first problem with the Age of War as a whole was that, even though the concept should have been exciting and invigorating, it didn't feel that way. Whereas the Age of Sorcery hit the ground running, the Age of War just kinda stumbled into existence and didn't really generate all that much hype with its contents initially. Starting off the Age with a foundational chapter didn't do a lot to build excitement, and the additions of treasure hoards in Chapter 1 felt kinda pointless when the Purge revamp was still 3 months away. There really wasn't that much interesting at the start of the Age of War, and I think that kind of got us off on the wrong foot. People didn't see much worth in gathering treasure and waiting 3 months to use it, and even though we knew what was coming down the line, the Age of War arrived with less of a bang and more of a whimper, which initially hurt perception of this age quite a lot. The second problem was the story, or unfortunately, a noted lack thereof. The Age of Sorcery was very lore heavy, perhaps a little too heavy for some. Understanding it wasn't required to take part in the content, but there was a lot of story there, with a ton of depth and room for exploration. I'm not sure you can consistently tell stories that deep all the time. It can end up rather tiresome for those that don't really care for it. And thus, I feel like the Age of War was designed as sort of a bit of breathing room as opposed to the really dense lore and storytelling of the Age of Sorcery, but perhaps that went a bit too far in the other direction. There wasn't really much story to speak of for the Age of War, for the most part. The Stygians come to the exile lands because they see our treasures as their right, not the right of the roving bandits or mercenaries of the Purge that came before. That's about all there is for premise, and it doesn't build too much from there. There were a few other things like the Sacred Hunt that added more story, but that's arguably from an after effect of the Age of War, so I'm not even sure if that counts. The story points of the Age of War boil down to this: the Stygians arrive, besiege the Exiles, build their fortress, and then the Exiles defeat them at Almoriah. Again, not every age needs a deep story that weaves all these parts together and has tons of room for exploration, but I think the player base wants a bit more than we got here. A lot of people said it didn't feel like war. Part of that is the gameplay features, but another part is the story. There were no world events to speak of really, no NPCs talking about it, the Age of War was just kinda there. When the Conan team does lore, they rarely ever miss, in my opinion. It's one of their big strengths. Given that the audience for this game does skew older, many of which will be familiar with the comics or even the source material itself, I think more of us enjoyed the story aspect than I or others initially expected. Given not everyone will get into as much detail as some of the lore hounds amongst us, people aren't going to make loads of videos. Well, maybe some of them, but the people playing Conan aren't the younger, dopamine-soaked audience of something like Call of Duty. We're not necessarily satisfied with just repetitive, boring gameplay. We need more. The Age of War's lighter approach to the story, in my opinion, probably hampered many people's enjoyments, as there just was no narrative to really latch onto. Thirdly, there were most certainly design issues that caused the Age of War to feel rather underwhelming at times. I really liked the Purge rework, but it essentially dropped in 3 phases. The first was the treasure phase, we've already covered that, it was really hollow. The rework itself came in Chapter 2 and was fairly good but not super challenging, and had issues with loot and actually enticing players to do the purges outside of the fun of them. The third came in Chapter 4 with the new Purge waves. They cranked the difficulty up and added some really good challenges, but again, there was still a little bit of an incentive problem. That will improve in the Age of Heroes when crafters are available in the Purge loot pool again, but the Purge rework itself took a very long time to reach the fully formed state it's in now, and until those new waves in Chapter 4 it did feel a bit underwhelming and not really like you were fighting a powerful army. The tavern system was really great, but also lacked a little in terms of design. Spawn rates for recruitable thralls in the tavern were fairly low, and outside of the roleplay aspect of having a tavern, little else could be done there aside from call Iskar the Sellsword or interact with Zil the Wanderer when the Sacred Hunt was active. The tavern system is frankly genius. A lot of people like it, but I think it could have been iterated upon more, maybe allowing you to passively generate gold through selling drinks and food to NPCs, or just weaving into more systems. The tavern mechanic is really foundational and will probably be great for setting up and telling stories in the future. To be fair, its launch was always going to be its weakest point because that's when it had the least amount of things, but not really much has changed there over the age. I think it's a system people really want to enjoy, but it's a bit shallow at the moment. The PvE raid on Al Moriah is probably one of the biggest design flaws in this update. Conceptually it sounds great. The player becomes the raider and sieges a base to put an end to the Stygian army. In practice it was close to disastrous in my opinion. The performance was dismal, the fort didn't scream Stygian in design, the loot wasn't great, and I think in retrospect they had a good idea with a destructible fort, but the forts on Siptar did it a lot better. I would rather Al Moriah have been an instance location away from the main map to reduce performance issues. I basically avoid the savannah like the plague now because I know that frame drainer fortress will be on the horizon, which is a shame because that spot is in a really nice area. Finally, on the design front, there was also the issue of just trying to fix things that weren't broken. Combat was made objectively worse by the rotation changes in Chapter 3, they didn't need to happen, neither did the inventory rework that caused loads of bugs and issues. People were used to the old inventory. Yeah, it wasn't perfect, but it didn't need a radical overhaul, perhaps just a little bit of tinkering. Same with the changes to the Dyer's bench. Yeah, they're more realistic, but it wasn't really a problem. Throughout the Age of War, most content unfortunately failed to deliver properly. Things were either not fully realised until much later after they were added, didn't live up to the potential, or changes were made to things that frankly just didn't need it. Now of course you can't really talk about the Age of War without talking about the bugs. Conan is no stranger to bugs, they've been a factor of some degree ever since I started playing in 2019, but the snowball effect became an avalanche in the Age of War. It seemed to be the perfect storm of coalescing factors, especially of time, which it became apparent that the dev team just didn't have enough of. Lack of time and insufficient quality assurance made basically every chapter buggy to some degree, from the moderate to the severe. When a new update was announced, the community reached the point of first asking what's going to be broken instead of what's new, and that's not a good thing to have. Given the number and scale of bugs though, I don't think there's any other way the community would react. The bugs soured the experience of most, if not all, of the Age of War, and the community's negativity and concerns about potential updates was largely warranted. On a similar note, consistency was an issue throughout the Age of War too. This encompasses the bugs, but also the quality of and content in the updates. Some updates had quite a bit of content, others had a lot less, with no guarantee of how much playtime you'd actually get out of what they were adding. Variance in actual amount of content in each update is natural to a degree, especially when you're dealing with content driven by a story, but the consistency wasn't there across the board for this age. Some chapters were hollow, some chapters were packed with content that didn't work properly, and people never really knew what to expect in terms of quality and, again, consistency. Finally, communication. Now, to be fair, Funcom's never been outstanding at communication, but at times when the community really needed to hear directly from the devs, communication sometimes wasn't as forthcoming as it should have been. Comms were decent for some issues, but it often felt like the dev team would just ghost us for a while when we really needed to hear something, even if it was just an acknowledgement of the issues and what the rough plan was to resolve them. The community just needs assurances that the issues they're experiencing are known and are being worked on. So ultimately then, why did the Age of War fail? It was a combination of failures, inconsistency, and missed opportunities. The Age failed to hit the ground running and unfortunately continued to barrel downhill with a slew of bugs and issues every time there was content added. It was the perfect storm of insufficient QA, failing to meet expectations, not having enough time to get everything done, and, to a degree, a disparity between what the devs were doing and what the community wanted. Looking towards the future then, will anything change? Well, being realistic, the potential is there. Conan isn't dead, nor is it doomed, but continuing down this path could render it so in the future. I think Conan has stuck around for so long because of its unique appeal. It has the cultural and literary backing that other survival games lack. Games like this come and go, and to be fair, Conan has a certain intangible appeal that really is, I think, the reason why people are so frustrated by the way the Age of War turned out. As far as I see it, unless development is stopped, which isn't happening, I don't think the game is unrecoverable. You only have to look at something like No Man's Sky or Cyberpunk to see how they managed to turn around huge problems, but it requires dedication. The dev team have made some pretty promising statements on that front. Along with changing the update cadence and saving resources by removing the battle pass, they've also hired more staff seemingly, including a new community manager, who has spearheaded some good communication on the forums. However, we've not actually had a major update drop in the new cadence cycle yet. I'd love to believe their statements will end up being reality, but ultimately without any real evidence of that, you can't say it is. The Age of Heroes Chapter 1 will be somewhat indicative of how far these changes have gone. There are still lingering issues from the Age of War, and given that development is always ahead of releases, it will probably take a while for the update cadence changes to become the new normal, and for development to adjust around that. However, with the extra time bought by the 4th chapter and the mid-season update, the Age of Heroes should be an improvement. I'm not sure if the first chapter is going to have an immediate impact just based on the stuff they're adding, but at this point the bugs are a bigger problem that needs to be tackled. Deal with them and then we can worry about impact and optics. On the hierarchy of needs, just being able to play the game is really the foundational one, and if they manage to fix some of the big issues and release this upcoming update in a reasonably playable state, it should at least be something of a good sign. It will take time to tell if the tides have truly turned, probably a fair few updates, but to be honest, I think the Age of War was probably as bad as things can get. This age was just cursed, unfortunately. Not everything was terrible, but there were enough terrible things to really sour the experience as a whole. A lot of eyes will be on the Age of Heroes across all of its updates to see if the game can pivot and improve. Hopefully in the future we can look back from a position of Conan being in a better state and see how things have gotten better. However, until then, the Age of War remains perhaps one of the darkest times in the history of Conan Exiles. Thank you for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. If you want to see videos early alongside plenty of exclusive benefits, do check out the Patreon through the link in the description and the pinned comment. Again, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.